Welcome, weary traveler, to another gentle journey through the mists of time. Let your shoulders drop. Let your breathing slow. Tonight, we're going to wander together through the smoky kitchens and bustling hearths of medieval Europe, where ordinary people lived extraordinary lives, one meal at a time. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Feel yourself sinking deeper into comfort as we step back 700 years into a world where every morsel of food told a story of survival, tradition, and the endless human desire to transform simple ingredients into something nourishing. Picture yourself walking through a small English village just as dawn breaks over the thatched roofs. The air is crisp and carries the scent of wood smoke curling from stone chimneys. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crows, and you can hear the gentle lowing of cattle being led to pasture. This is a world where the rhythm of life moves with the sun, where every day begins with the ancient ritual of coaxing fire back to life from last night's carefully banked embers. The village spreads before you like a patchwork quilt of small plots and winding lanes. Here lives the blacksmith, there the miller, and scattered throughout are the homes of serfs and free peasants, each family bound to the land in their own way. Above them all, literally and figuratively, stands the manor house where the lord of the estate resides, while in the distance, the spire of the village church points toward heaven, its bells marking the hours of prayer that structure each day. In this carefully ordered world, everyone has their place. The serf works the Lord's land in exchange for protection and a small plot of their own. The free peasant owns their humble acres outright, but still owes service to their betters. The merchant travels between towns, bringing news and exotic goods. The knight serves his lord with sword and horse, while the cleric tends to souls and, quite often, to bodies as well. And at the top of this pyramid sits the Lord, responsible for the welfare of all who dwell within his domain. But what united all these people, from the lowest bondsman to the highest noble, was hunger. Not always the gnawing desperation of famine, though that specter haunted every generation, but the simple daily need for sustenance. And so, as the sun climbs higher and the morning mist begins to burn away, let us follow these medieval people as they begin their eternal quest for their daily bread. The rhythm of eating in the Middle Ages was far different from our modern pattern of breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Medieval people typically ate just 2 meals a day, and these were substantial affairs designed to fuel bodies that performed hard physical labor from dawn to dusk. The first meal, called dinner, was eaten around mid-morning, perhaps 10 or 11 o'clock. The second, called supper, came in the late afternoon, usually around 4 or 5 o'clock, well before darkness fell. This pattern was not merely a matter of preference, but of necessity. Without artificial lighting, the day's activities were compressed into the hours of sunlight. People rose with the sun and went to bed shortly after it set. The 2-meal system maximized the time available for work while ensuring that the body received adequate nourishment for the day's labors. The timing of meals was also heavily influenced by the Christian calendar, which punctuated the year with approximately 140 fast days. These were not merely suggestions, but religious obligations that carried the weight of moral law. On fast days, which included every Friday, the 40 days of Lent, the 12 days before Christmas, and numerous other holy days, the faithful were forbidden to eat meat, dairy products, or eggs. Instead, they survived on bread, vegetables, and fish. The contrast between fast days and feast days was stark. On feast days, which celebrated major religious holidays like Easter and Christmas, as well as important life events like weddings and harvest celebrations, the usual restrictions were lifted and people indulged in foods that were normally beyond their reach. These occasions were marked by communal cooking, sharing of resources, and the kind of abundance that made the lean times bearable. But whether on fast days or feast days, the caloric needs of medieval people were substantial. A man engaged in heavy agricultural work might require 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day, while women performing household tasks and caring for children needed somewhat less, but still far more than a modern sedentary lifestyle would demand. Every calorie had to be earned through back-breaking labor, and every scrap of food was precious. As our imaginary morning progresses, you might wonder about breakfast. Surely these hard-working people needed something to sustain them through the early hours of the day? The answer is both yes and no. The concept of breakfast as we know it simply did not exist for most adults in medieval society. Breaking the fast of the night was considered a sign of weakness, gluttony, or illness. A healthy adult was expected to begin the day's work immediately upon rising, and to sustain themselves until the proper time for dinner. However, there were exceptions. Children, the elderly, and the sick were often given small amounts of food in the early morning. This might consist of a piece of bread, perhaps dipped in wine or weak ale or a simple broth. But for the vast majority of the population, the morning began with what was called the morning's draught, a cup of weak ale and perhaps a heel of bread left over from the previous day. Imagine holding that clay cup in your hands, feeling its rough texture and the warmth of the liquid within. The ale would be thin and slightly sour, nothing like the strong beer we know today, but it served an important purpose. In an age when water was often contaminated and dangerous to drink, weak ale provided safe hydration. The brewing process, even when it produced a beverage with very low alcohol content, killed many of the harmful bacteria that might lurk in water drawn from wells or streams. The bread that accompanied this morning draught would be dense and dark, made from whatever grains were available locally. It might be slightly stale, but that was no matter. Stale bread was not wasted, but repurposed in countless ways throughout the day. It could be soaked in broth to make a simple porridge, used as a thickener for stews, or simply gnawed upon to provide sustenance during long hours of work. As you sit in this quiet morning moment, cup in hand, let yourself feel the weight of centuries. This simple ritual of breaking the night's fast with bread and ale connected medieval people to their ancestors and their descendants, a chain of human experience stretching back to the very beginning of civilization. Now, as the morning light grows stronger and the village begins to stir more actively, it's time to explore the foundation of medieval nutrition, grain. In a world where crop failure meant starvation, grain was quite literally life itself. The phrase daily bread carried a weight of meaning that we can barely comprehend today. Every kernel of wheat, rye, barley, or oats was precious beyond measure. The type of grain that dominated a region's diet depended largely on climate and soil conditions. In the warmer, more fertile areas of southern England and continental Europe, wheat was the preferred grain. From wheat came the finest breads, including the coveted manchet loaves that graced the tables of the wealthy. These were made from carefully sifted flour, producing a white bread that was both a luxury and a status symbol. But for most people, wheat was beyond reach. Instead, they relied on hardier grains like rye, which grew well in poorer soils and cooler climates. Rye bread was dark, dense, and had a distinctive sour flavor that came from the wild yeasts used in fermentation. It was more nutritious than white bread, containing more fiber and minerals, but it was also more likely to harbor ergot, a fungus that could cause hallucinations and even death if consumed in large quantities. In Scotland and other northern regions, oats were the grain of choice. Oats grew well in wet, cool conditions where wheat would fail, and they provided excellent nutrition for both humans and livestock. The Scottish tradition of eating oatmeal porridge for breakfast has its roots in these medieval patterns of cultivation and consumption. On the continent, spelt was common in Germanic regions, while barley thrived in many areas and was particularly valued for brewing. Each grain had its own characteristics, its own uses, and its own place in the complex web of medieval agriculture. The transformation of grain into food was a daily miracle that required skill, patience, and back-breaking labor. Let us follow a typical housewife as she prepares the basic pottage that would sustain her family through another day. She begins by checking her store of grain, measuring out the precious barley with careful hands. Every grain counts, and waste is not an option. The barley is poured into a large iron pot, and water is added, not too much, not too little. The art lies in knowing exactly how much liquid will create the perfect consistency. Next come the vegetables, onions, always onions, for they grow easily and store well through the winter months. Their sharp bite will mellow into sweetness as they cook. Leeks, if available, add their own subtle flavor and bulk out the pot. Perhaps some turnips or parsnips, diced small so they will cook evenly. In summer, there might be fresh peas or beans, but in winter, the family must rely on what has been dried and stored. Herbs come next, gathered from the kitchen garden or the hedgerows. A handful of sage, its gray-green leaves releasing their pungent aroma as they're crushed between the fingers. Some parsley, bright green and fresh-tasting. Perhaps a sprig of thyme or a few leaves of sorrel. These are not mere seasonings, but essential sources of vitamins and minerals that will help ward off the diseases that come with poor nutrition. The pot is placed over the fire, and the long, slow process of cooking begins. This is not a rushed affair, but a meditative rhythm that has been followed for generations. The wooden spoon moves in steady circles, stirring the contents as they bubble and thicken. The smell that rises from the pot is earthy and comforting, the aroma of home and survival. As the pottage cooks, steam rises and fills the small house with warmth and the promise of nourishment. The woman tends the fire carefully, adding wood as needed to maintain the steady heat. Too much fire and the pottage will scorch on the bottom. Too little and it will never properly cook. This is knowledge passed down from mother to daughter, a wisdom born of necessity and refined by experience. The finished pottage is thick enough to stand a spoon in, rich with the flavors of all its ingredients. It might not sound appealing to modern tastes, but to a medieval family, it represented security, warmth, and the satisfaction of another day's hunger staved off. Served in wooden bowls and eaten with wooden spoons, it connected them to the land that provided their sustenance and to the community that shared their struggles. But grain was not the only staple that sustained medieval people. Dairy products played a crucial role, though they were consumed in forms that might seem strange to us today. Fresh milk was a luxury that only those who owned cows could enjoy regularly, and even then, it was often reserved for the very young or the very old. Most milk was quickly transformed into cheese or churned into butter, processes that both preserved it and made it safer to consume. The cheese-making process was a skilled art that required precise timing and careful attention to temperature and humidity. Fresh milk was heated gently and curdled with rennet, often obtained from the stomach lining of a young calf. The curds were then separated from the whey, pressed, and aged in cool, dark places. The result was a variety of cheeses, from soft, fresh varieties that were eaten within days to hard, aged wheels that could last for months. Green cheese was not green in color but fresh and unaged, with a mild flavor and soft texture. It was often eaten within a week of making and provided a valuable source of protein and calcium. Harder cheeses were aged for months or even years, developing complex flavors and becoming valuable trade goods that could be transported over long distances. Butter was another precious commodity, but its availability varied greatly by region and climate. In the cooler northern areas, butter could be made and stored more easily, while in warmer southern regions, it was more likely to spoil quickly. As a result, many Mediterranean communities relied more heavily on olive oil for cooking and food preparation. During the long weeks of Lent and other fasting periods when dairy products were forbidden, cooks turned to alternatives like almond milk. This was made by grinding almonds with water and straining out the solids, creating a creamy liquid that could be used in cooking much like dairy milk. It was expensive, as almonds had to be imported from warmer climates, but it allowed the faithful to maintain some variety in their diet while observing religious restrictions. Eggs were another crucial source of protein, and their availability followed the natural rhythms of the seasons. Hens laid most prolifically in spring and early summer, when daylight hours were longest and food was most abundant. During these months, eggs were plentiful and relatively inexpensive. But as autumn approached and the days shortened, egg production declined, making them a precious commodity during the winter months. The medieval housewife knew every one of her hens individually, understanding their laying patterns and personalities. She would make her rounds each morning, checking the nesting boxes and hedgerows where the birds might have hidden their eggs. The excitement of finding a clutch of eggs in an unexpected place was one of the small joys that brightened the daily routine of survival. Fresh eggs were eaten immediately, often soft-boiled and served with bread for dipping, but surplus eggs were preserved in various ways. They might be packed in salt, buried in grain, or preserved in lime water. These methods could keep eggs edible for months, providing protein during the lean winter season when fresh food was scarce. The versatility of eggs made them invaluable in medieval cooking. They could be scrambled with herbs, baked into custards, or used as binding agents in other dishes. Egg yolks were particularly prized for their richness and were often reserved for special occasions or for feeding the sick and elderly. As our journey through medieval nutrition continues, we must turn our attention to the proteins that provided the strength and substance these hard-working people needed. Meat was not an everyday food for most medieval people, but when it was available, it was consumed with great appreciation and little waste. For the peasant class, pork was by far the most common meat. Pigs were ideal livestock for small farmers because they required little land, ate scraps, and refuse that would otherwise go to waste, and converted this low-quality food into high-quality protein with remarkable efficiency. A single pig could feed a family for months when properly preserved, and every part of the animal was used. The autumn slaughter was one of the most important events in the peasant calendar. As the weather cooled and the last of the acorns fell from the oak trees, it was time to kill the pigs that had fattened on forest mast all summer. This was hard, bloody work that required skill and experience. The animal had to be killed quickly and cleanly, then immediately processed to prevent spoilage. Nothing was wasted. The best cuts were salted and smoked for long-term storage. The fat was rendered into lard, which would be used for cooking throughout the year. The organs were made into puddings and sausages. Even the blood was collected and transformed into blood sausage, while the bones were boiled to make nutritious broth. The process of smoking meat was both art and science. The meat was hung in especially constructed smokehouses, where it was exposed to the smoke of carefully chosen woods. Oak was preferred for its mild flavor, while fruit woods like apple or cherry added their own subtle notes. The smoking process could take days or even weeks, depending on the size of the cuts and the desired preservation time. For the wealthy, a much wider variety of meats was available. Venison from the Lord's Deer Park was a prized delicacy, as was wild boar hunted in the forest. These game meats were the exclusive privilege of the nobility, protected by strict laws that made poaching a serious crime. A peasant caught taking a deer from the Lord's forest could face severe punishment, including imprisonment or even death. The wealthy also enjoyed domestic meats that were beyond the reach of common people. Beef was expensive because cattle were more valuable alive than dead, providing milk, labor, and manure. Lamb and mutton were seasonal treats, as sheep were primarily raised for their wool. Poultry, including chickens, geese, and ducks, graced the tables of the prosperous, while peacocks and swans were reserved for the most elaborate feasts. But for everyone, regardless of social class, Friday was a day of fish. The church's prohibition on eating meat on Fridays during Lent and on numerous other fast days created a huge demand for fish and other seafood. This religious requirement had profound effects on medieval economics and culture, driving the development of fishing industries and trade routes that connected distant communities. River fish like trout, salmon, and pike were caught in local streams and rivers. But the real backbone of the medieval fish trade was the humble herring. These small, oily fish swam in vast schools in the North Sea and the Baltic, and they could be caught in enormous quantities during their seasonal migrations. Herring could be salted, smoked, or pickled, creating a protein source that could last for months and be transported over long distances. The great herring fairs of Northern Europe were among the most important commercial events of the medieval calendar. Merchants from across the continent gathered to buy and sell these preserved fish, creating wealth for entire regions and connecting communities that might otherwise have had little contact with each other. Eels were another important fish, particularly in areas with marshes and slow-moving rivers. These snake-like creatures were considered a delicacy and were often prepared as elaborate pies for special occasions. The wealthy maintained eel ponds on their estates, carefully managing these artificial habitats to ensure a steady supply of fresh fish. In coastal areas, the variety of available seafood was much greater. Cod, plaice, mackerel, and dozens of other species were caught and consumed fresh or preserved for later use. Shellfish like mussels, oysters, and crabs were gathered from tidal pools and shallow waters, providing protein that was free for the taking to those who knew where to look. The preparation of fish required considerable skill and knowledge. Fresh fish had to be cleaned and cooked quickly to prevent spoilage, while preserved fish needed to be soaked and prepared carefully to remove excess salt and restore palatability. Fish bones had to be removed skillfully to prevent choking, and the various species required different cooking methods to bring out their best flavors. Fish cookery was particularly important in monastery kitchens, where the monks observed strict dietary rules throughout the year. Monastic cooks became experts at preparing fish in dozens of different ways, creating elaborate dishes that satisfied both religious requirements and the human desire for variety and flavor. The medieval obsession with fish during fasting periods led to some creative interpretations of religious law. Beavers were sometimes classified as fish because they lived in water and had scale-like tails. Water birds like ducks and geese were occasionally permitted during Lent because they spent so much time in aquatic environments. These theological gymnastics reflected the very human desire to find loopholes in restrictive rules while still maintaining the appearance of obedience. Now, as we delve deeper into the medieval kitchen, we must consider the crucial question of flavor. The popular image of medieval food as bland, monotonous, and barely edible is far from the truth. Medieval cooks worked with a sophisticated understanding of herbs, spices, and seasoning that created complex, satisfying flavors from simple ingredients. The herb garden was the heart of medieval cooking, a carefully tended plot where the housewife grew the plants that would transform basic ingredients into satisfying meals. Sage, with its gray-green leaves and powerful flavor, was perhaps the most important herb. It was believed to have powerful medicinal properties and was used in everything from meat dishes to healing teas. There was even a Latin proverb that asked, "Why should a man die while sage grows in his garden?" Parsley grew in every garden, providing fresh green color and bright flavor throughout the growing season. Its high vitamin C content helped prevent scurvy, though medieval people didn't understand the nutritional science behind this benefit. They simply knew that fresh herbs made food taste better and seemed to promote health. Hyssop, with its slightly minty flavor, was used both as a culinary herb and as a medicinal plant. It was believed to cleanse the blood and purify the body, making it especially popular during times of illness or after periods of indulgence. Rosemary, with its needle-like leaves and powerful aroma, was prized for its ability to preserve meat and add flavor to roasted dishes. Thyme, oregano, and marjoram grew wild in many areas and were gathered from hedgerows and fields. These herbs were dried and stored for winter use, providing essential flavors during the months when fresh herbs were unavailable. The process of drying herbs was a skilled art that required perfect timing and careful attention to temperature and humidity. But the real treasures of medieval cooking were the imported spices that came from distant lands along the Silk Roads and spice routes. These exotic seasonings were literally worth their weight in gold, and their presence on the table was a clear sign of wealth and status. Black pepper was the most important of these spices, so valuable that it was sometimes used as currency. Peppercorns were counted individually, and a pound of pepper could be worth more than a laborer's annual wages. The pungent heat of pepper could transform the simplest dish into something exotic and exciting. Cinnamon came from the bark of trees that grew in far-off Ceylon, while nutmeg and mace traveled even further from the remote spice islands of Southeast Asia. These aromatic spices were used sparingly, not just because of their cost, but because medieval cooks understood that a little went a long way. Saffron, made from the dried stigmas of crocus flowers, was perhaps the most expensive spice of all. It took over 150 flowers to produce just 1 gram of saffron, and the delicate threads had to be harvested by hand during a brief window when the flowers were in bloom. But the golden color and distinctive flavor that saffron provided made it worth the enormous cost for special occasions. Ginger, imported from India and China, was prized for its warming properties and its ability to aid digestion. It was used in both sweet and savory dishes and was often preserved in syrup to make it last longer. Cloves, with their intensely aromatic flavor, were stuck into oranges and other fruits to create pomanders that would scent and purify the air. Medieval cooks combined these precious spices into complex blends that were used to season different types of dishes. Poudre douce, or sweet powder, was a mixture of cinnamon, ginger, and other warm spices that was used to season desserts and delicate dishes. Poudre forte, or strong powder, contained more pungent spices like pepper and was used for meat dishes and hearty stews. The art of spice blending was closely guarded knowledge, passed down through generations of cooks and jealously protected by the guilds that controlled the spice trade. Each cook had their own secret combinations and proportions, creating signature flavors that could make or break a reputation. The high cost of spices led to the development of many substitute ingredients that could provide similar flavors at a fraction of the cost. Mustard seed, which grew locally in many areas, provided heat and pungency. Horseradish root, grated fresh, could substitute for exotic peppers. Local herbs like wild garlic and onions provided sharp, savory flavors that enhanced simple dishes. But even these humble seasonings were precious and were used with care and respect. Every seed, leaf, and root represented human labor and the bounty of the earth. Waste was not just economically foolish, but morally wrong, a sin against both God and community. The medieval understanding of flavor was also deeply connected to medical theory. The doctrine of humors, inherited from ancient Greek medicine, taught that all foods had inherent properties that could affect the balance of the body. Hot, dry foods were thought to counteract cold, wet conditions, while cooling foods could balance excess heat. This medical understanding of food meant that seasoning was not just a matter of taste, but of health. Certain combinations of herbs and spices were believed to aid digestion, prevent illness, and promote longevity. The skilled cook was part chef, part pharmacist, creating meals that satisfied both the palate and the body's need for balance. As we continue our journey through medieval foodways, we must address one of the most critical challenges faced by our ancestors: keeping food from spoiling. Without refrigeration, canning, or other modern preservation methods, medieval people had to rely on techniques that had been developed over centuries of trial and error. Salt was the most important preservative, and control of salt sources was often a matter of life and death for entire communities. Salt could be mined from underground deposits, evaporated from seawater, or extracted from salt marshes. The process was labor-intensive and often dangerous, but the results were essential for survival. Salting meat was a skilled process that required precise timing and technique. The meat was first cut into appropriate sizes, then packed in layers with coarse salt. The salt drew moisture from the meat, creating an environment where harmful bacteria could not survive. The process took days or weeks, depending on the size of the cuts and the desired level of preservation. Pickling was another important preservation method, particularly for vegetables. Cabbage was fermented into sauerkraut, a process that not only preserved the vegetable, but also created beneficial bacteria that aided digestion. Onions, cucumbers, and other vegetables were preserved in vinegar or verjuice, the acidic juice of unripe grapes. Smoking was both a preservation method and a way to add flavor to foods. Meat and fish were hung in specially constructed smokehouses, where they were exposed to smoke from smoldering wood fires. The smoke created a hostile environment for bacteria, while imparting complex flavors that made preserved foods more palatable. Potting was a technique used for preserving cooked meats. The meat was cooked until very tender, then packed tightly in pots and covered with clarified fat or butter. The fat created an airtight seal that prevented spoilage, and the potted meat could last for months if stored properly. Honey was used as both a preservative and a sweetener. Its high sugar content and natural antibacterial properties made it ideal for preserving fruits and other delicate foods. Honey was often the only sweetener available to medieval people, as sugar was an exotic import that was far too expensive for most families. The techniques of food preservation were closely guarded secrets, passed down through families and communities. A household that could successfully preserve food through the winter months had a significant advantage over those who lacked these skills. The knowledge could mean the difference between survival and starvation during the lean months of late winter and early spring. Winter food storage was a complex undertaking that required careful planning and precise execution. Root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and carrots were stored in root cellars, buried in sand or stored in pits lined with straw. Apples and pears were carefully wrapped and stored in cool, dark places where they could last for months. Grain was stored in large wooden chests or stone granaries, carefully protected from moisture and rodents. The ever-present threat of rats and mice meant that every storage area had to be designed with these pests in mind. Cats were valued not just as companions, but as essential partners in the fight against vermin. The battle against rats was a constant one, and every household had its strategies for keeping these destructive creatures at bay. Some families kept terriers specifically trained to hunt rats, while others relied on traps and poisons. The rat catcher was a respected professional who traveled from town to town, offering his services to those who could afford them. Stories of rat catchers were common in medieval folklore, often featuring clever individuals who used their wits to solve infestations that had defeated others. These tales reflected the very real importance of pest control in a world where a single family of rats could destroy enough stored food to cause genuine hardship. The medieval manor house cellars were marvels of food storage technology, with separate areas for different types of provisions. Wine cellars maintained steady temperatures for aging beverages, while food cellars were designed to keep various types of preserved foods in optimal conditions. The successful management of these storage areas was a skill that required years of experience and careful attention to detail. But even the most skilled food preservation could not completely eliminate the risk of spoilage and food poisoning. Medieval people lived with constant awareness of these dangers, and they developed sophisticated methods for detecting and avoiding contaminated food. They knew the signs of spoiled meat, the smell of rancid fat, and the appearance of moldy grain. The consequences of eating spoiled food could be severe, ranging from mild stomach upset to serious illness or even death. This knowledge made medieval people cautious about food safety in ways that might seem excessive to modern eyes. They preferred to err on the side of caution, discarding food that seemed questionable rather than risk the consequences of food poisoning. Now, let us step away from the humble peasant cottage and enter the great hall of a medieval manor where food took on dimensions of spectacle, ceremony, and social display that transformed eating into performance art. The Great Hall Banquet was the pinnacle of medieval dining, a carefully orchestrated event that demonstrated the wealth, power, and sophistication of the host. The preparation for a great banquet began days or even weeks in advance. Master cooks planned elaborate menus that would showcase the finest ingredients and the most skilled techniques. Every dish was designed not just to taste magnificent, but to create visual drama that would amaze and impress the guests. The banquet was typically organized into 3 courses, but these were not courses as we understand them today. Instead, each course consisted of multiple dishes served simultaneously, creating a lavish display of abundance. The first course might include various soups, roasted meats, and elaborate pies. The second course would feature different preparations, perhaps roasted birds, fish dishes, and vegetable preparations. The third course was often the most spectacular, featuring the most exotic and expensive ingredients. The trencher system was the standard method of serving food in the Great Hall. Instead of individual plates, each diner was provided with a thick slice of stale bread called a trencher. This bread plate absorbed the juices from the food and could be eaten at the end of the meal or given to the poor who waited outside the hall for scraps. The seating arrangement in the Great Hall was a precise reflection of social hierarchy. The most important guests sat at the high table, elevated above the rest of the diners and positioned to display their status to everyone present. The great salt cellar, often an elaborate work of art made from precious metals, was placed in the center of the high table, and its position determined precedence. Those who sat above the salt were of higher rank than those who sat below the salt. The ritual of hand-washing before meals was an important ceremony that demonstrated both cleanliness and courtesy. Servants would bring ewers of warm water scented with rose petals, and each diner would wash their hands in full view of the other guests. This ritual served practical purposes in an age when people ate with their hands, but it also reinforced social norms and expectations. The entertainment during banquets was as carefully planned as the food itself. Jongleurs, minstrels, and other performers would entertain the diners between courses with music, poetry, and acrobatic displays. These performances were not merely background entertainment, but integral parts of the dining experience, creating atmosphere and providing talking points for conversation. The most spectacular dishes were those that combined culinary skill with artistic presentation. A roasted peacock might be redressed in its own feathers, creating the illusion that the bird was still alive. Elaborate pastry constructions called subtleties were created to mark special occasions or honor important guests. These could be architectural marvels featuring castles, ships, or mythical creatures made entirely from sugar and pastry. The subtleties were not just decorative, but often contained hidden meanings and messages. A sugar castle might represent the host's military prowess, while a pastry ship could symbolize successful trade ventures. These edible artworks required months of planning and the combined skills of master bakers, sugar workers, and artists. The preparation of these elaborate banquets required enormous resources and a small army of skilled workers. The kitchen staff might include master cooks, assistant cooks, pastry specialists, sauce makers, and dozens of servants responsible for various aspects of food preparation and service. The coordination required to produce a successful banquet was comparable to staging a major theatrical production. The serving of food in the Great Hall followed strict protocols that reflected the importance of ceremony and hierarchy. Each dish was presented with great formality, and the carving of meat was performed by skilled carvers who were trained in the proper techniques for each type of roast. The carving of a roast swan or peacock was a performance in itself, requiring both skill and dramatic flair. The Great Hall banquet was also an important economic event, demonstrating the host's wealth and resources to potential allies and rivals. The cost of such a feast could be enormous, sometimes representing months or even years of a lord's income, but the investment was considered worthwhile for the political and social advantages it could provide. The leftovers from these great banquets were not wasted, but carefully distributed according to social custom. The best remains went to favored servants and retainers, while other scraps were given to the poor who gathered outside the hall. This system of distribution reinforced social bonds and demonstrated the Lord's generosity and concern for his dependents. The memories of these great banquets lived on long after the last crumb had been consumed, becoming part of the oral tradition that celebrated the generosity and magnificence of great lords. Songs and stories about particularly memorable feasts were passed down through generations, creating legends that enhanced the reputation of both the host and the occasion. As we consider what our medieval ancestors drank, we enter a world where the very act of finding safe beverages was a constant challenge. The relationship between medieval people and their drinks was shaped by necessity, tradition, and the ever-present awareness that water, the most basic of all beverages, could be dangerous to consume. The problem with water was simple. It was often contaminated with dangerous bacteria and parasites that could cause serious illness or death. Medieval people understood this danger, even if they didn't understand the scientific reasons behind it. They knew that water from certain sources was more likely to make them sick, and they developed sophisticated strategies for finding and using safe water sources. The solution to the water problem was alcohol, specifically weak ale, that contained just enough alcohol to kill harmful bacteria while remaining safe for daily consumption. This small ale was the standard beverage for people of all ages, from young children to elderly adults. It was consumed at every meal and throughout the day, providing both hydration and a small amount of nutrition. The brewing of small ale was typically women's work, and every household had its own brewing methods and recipes. The alewife was a respected figure in medieval communities, responsible for providing this essential beverage to her family and often to her neighbors as well. Her skill in brewing could mean the difference between health and illness for everyone who depended on her. The brewing process began with malting, the conversion of grain into malt by allowing it to sprout and then stopping the process with heat. This activated enzymes that would convert the grain starches into fermentable sugars. The malted grain was then mixed with hot water to create a sweet liquid called wort. The wort was boiled with herbs and spices to add flavor and help preserve the finished ale. Hops, which we associate with beer today, were not widely used in Northern Europe until the later medieval period. Instead, brewers used a mixture called gruit, which might include herbs like bog myrtle, yarrow, rosemary, or juniper berries. Each region had its own traditional gruit mixture, creating distinctive local flavors that travelers could recognize immediately. After boiling, the wort was cooled, and wild yeasts were allowed to begin fermentation. These yeasts were everywhere in the medieval environment, floating in the air and living on wooden brewing equipment. Successful brewing depended on encouraging the right kinds of yeast while preventing harmful bacteria from taking hold. This required skill, experience, and a considerable amount of luck. The fermentation process took several days, during which the brewers watched carefully for signs that the process was proceeding correctly. The ale was ready when it had developed the right flavor and a slight effervescence, but before it became too alcoholic or developed off flavors. Timing was crucial, and experienced alewives could judge the readiness of their brew by smell, taste, and appearance. Fresh ale was best consumed within a few days of brewing, before it had a chance to spoil or become too sour. This meant that brewing was a constant activity in medieval households, with small batches being produced regularly to maintain a steady supply. The wooden barrels and containers used for storage had to be kept scrupulously clean to prevent contamination. The quality of ale varied enormously depending on the skill of the brewer, the quality of ingredients, and the conditions under which it was made. Good ale was clear, flavorful, and refreshing. Poor ale could be cloudy, sour, or even dangerous to drink. The reputation of an alewife depended entirely on her ability to produce consistently good ale, and competition between brewers could be fierce. In towns and cities, commercial brewers operated taverns and ale houses where travelers and locals could purchase ale by the cup or jug. These establishments were important social centers where news was exchanged, business was conducted, and friendships were formed. The ale stake, a long pole with a bush or other marker at the top, indicated that fresh ale was available for sale. The regulation of ale quality and pricing was a constant concern for medieval authorities. Ale tasters were appointed to sample the products of local brewers and ensure that they met community standards. Brewers who sold weak, overpriced, or contaminated ale could face significant fines or other punishments. Stronger alcoholic beverages were available, but were generally consumed in smaller quantities and on special occasions. Mead, made from fermented honey, was an ancient drink that carried associations with celebration and ceremony. The production of mead required significant amounts of honey, making it expensive and special. Wine was the preferred drink of the wealthy, particularly in southern regions where grapes could be grown successfully. The wine trade connected medieval Europe to distant regions, bringing varieties from France, Germany, Spain, and even the eastern Mediterranean. Each region produced wines with distinctive characteristics, and connoisseurs could identify the origin of a wine by its taste and aroma. The storage and aging of wine required specialized knowledge and equipment. Wine cellars were carefully designed to maintain steady temperatures and humidity levels that would allow wines to develop complex flavors over time. The best wines could improve for years or even decades, becoming increasingly valuable as they aged. In northern regions where grapes could not be grown reliably, cider became the alcoholic drink of choice. Apple trees grew well in cooler climates, and apples could be fermented into a beverage that was both refreshing and long-lasting. Pear cider, made from fermented pears, was also popular in areas where pear trees flourished. The production of cider followed similar principles to ale brewing, but required different techniques and timing. Apples were pressed to extract their juice, which was then allowed to ferment naturally. The resulting cider could range from mildly alcoholic to quite strong, depending on the fermentation conditions and the length of aging. Stronger spirits were rare in the early medieval period, but became more common as distillation techniques spread from the Islamic world into Christian Europe. Aqua vitae, the water of life, was primarily used for medicinal purposes rather than regular consumption. These early spirits were harsh and powerful, lacking the refinement that would come with centuries of improved distillation methods. The medieval understanding of alcohol was closely tied to medical theory. Moderate consumption of alcoholic beverages was considered healthy and even necessary for proper digestion and overall well-being. Different types of alcohol were thought to have different effects on the body, and physicians would prescribe specific drinks for various ailments. The social aspects of drinking were as important as the physical benefits. Sharing a drink was a way of cementing friendships, sealing business deals, and demonstrating hospitality. The refusal to drink with someone could be interpreted as an insult or a sign of distrust. Drinking customs varied from region to region, but the importance of alcohol in social interactions was universal. The monastery breweries became centers of innovation and quality in medieval brewing. Monks had the time, resources, and dedication necessary to perfect their brewing techniques, and many monasteries became famous for the quality of their ales and wines. The Benedictine rule allowed for moderate consumption of alcohol, and monks were expected to be knowledgeable about brewing as part of their practical education. The medicinal use of alcohol was extensive in medieval medicine. Wine was used as an antiseptic for cleaning wounds, while various herbal wines and ales were prescribed for everything from digestive problems to respiratory ailments. The combination of alcohol with medicinal herbs created tinctures and cordials that were among the most effective medicines available to medieval physicians. As we delve deeper into the medieval understanding of food and drink, we encounter a fascinating world where eating was never simply about nutrition, but was always interconnected with medicine, religion, and supernatural belief. The medieval theory of humors, inherited from ancient Greek and Roman medicine, provided a comprehensive framework for understanding how food affected the body and mind. According to humoral theory, all foods possessed inherent qualities that could be categorized as hot or cold, wet or dry. These qualities were not related to the actual temperature or moisture content of the food, but were mystical properties that affected the balance of the four humors in the human body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Bread, the foundation of medieval diet, was considered hot and dry, making it an ideal food for balancing excess moisture in the body. The crust was thought to be especially beneficial because the baking process concentrated its hot, dry qualities. This belief led to the practice of giving bread crust to people suffering from conditions attributed to excess cold and wet humors. Lettuce and other leafy green vegetables were classified as cold and moist, making them suitable for cooling the body during hot weather or for treating conditions caused by excessive heat. However, this also meant that they were considered potentially dangerous for people whose constitutions were already too cold and wet, particularly the elderly and those recovering from illness. Meat was generally considered hot and moist, with different types of meat having different humoral properties. Beef was thought to be particularly hot and was recommended for people engaged in heavy physical labor. Pork was considered more moderate in its humoral qualities, making it suitable for most people. Fish was generally classified as cold and moist, which explained why it was appropriate food for fasting periods when the body needed cooling and spiritual purification. The timing of meal was also influenced by humoral theory. Heavy, hot foods were best consumed during the day when the body's natural heat was strongest. Light, cool foods were more appropriate for evening meals when the body was preparing for the cool, moist conditions of sleep. Seasonal eating patterns followed humoral principles as well. Summer called for cooling foods like fresh fruits and vegetables, while winter required warming foods like roasted meats and spiced wines. This seasonal approach to eating aligned well with the natural availability of different foods throughout the year. The preparation methods also affected the humoral qualities of foods. Roasting was thought to increase the hot, dry qualities of food, while boiling made foods more cold and moist. Frying fell somewhere between these extremes. These beliefs influenced cooking methods and meant that the same ingredient could have different medicinal effects depending on how it was prepared. Spices were particularly important in humoral medicine because of their powerful hot, dry qualities. Pepper, ginger, and cinnamon were used not just for flavor, but to counteract the cold, moist qualities of other foods. This medical understanding of spices provided additional justification for their high cost and prestigious status. The concept of individual constitution meant that the same food could be beneficial for one person and harmful for another. A person with a naturally hot, dry constitution needed different foods than someone who was cold and wet by nature. Skilled physicians could diagnose a person's humoral balance and prescribe appropriate diets to maintain health and treat illness. Garlic held a special place in medieval medicine and superstition. Its powerful hot, dry qualities made it valuable for treating cold, wet conditions like respiratory ailments. But garlic was also believed to have protective powers against supernatural threats, particularly plague and evil influences. Many people wore cloves of garlic around their necks or hung braids of garlic in their homes to ward off disease and malevolent spirits. The famous proverb about sage, "Why should a man die while sage grows in his garden?" reflected the medieval belief in the powerful medicinal properties of this common herb. Sage was thought to strengthen memory, promote longevity, and protect against a wide range of ailments. Its hot, dry qualities made it particularly valuable for elderly people whose constitutions were thought to become increasingly cold and moist with age. Herbal wines and ales were common forms of medieval medicine, combining the beneficial effects of alcohol with the medicinal properties of various plants. Wormwood wine was used to treat digestive ailments and parasites. Elderflower wine was prescribed for respiratory problems. Dandelion ale was thought to cleanse the liver and kidneys. The preparation of these medicinal beverages required extensive knowledge of both brewing techniques and herbal properties. The timing of herb gathering was crucial, with many plants being most potent when collected at specific times of day or phases of the moon. The drying and storage of herbs required equal care to preserve their medicinal virtues. Medieval people also believed in the power of sympathetic magic, where foods that resembled parts of the body could be used to treat ailments in those areas. Walnuts, which resembled the brain, were thought to improve mental function. Carrots, which looked like eyes, were used to treat vision problems. While these beliefs seem naive to modern understanding, they reflect the medieval desire to find meaning and connection in the natural world. The doctrine of signatures, which held that God had marked plants with signs indicating their medicinal uses, was another important aspect of medieval food medicine. Yellow flowers like calendula were used to treat jaundice and liver problems. Red plants were thought to be good for blood disorders. Heart-shaped leaves indicated plants that could treat heart conditions. The monastic tradition played a crucial role in preserving and developing medical knowledge about food and herbs. Monastery gardens were centers of botanical learning where monks cultivated medicinal plants and experimented with their preparation and use. The monastery infirmary was both a hospital and a laboratory where the healing properties of foods were studied and refined. The medieval understanding of food as medicine extended beyond physical health to include mental and spiritual well-being. Certain foods were thought to promote courage, wisdom, or spiritual insight. Others were believed to cause anger, melancholy, or moral corruption. This holistic view of nutrition recognized that food affected the entire person, not just the body. Fasting was considered one of the most powerful forms of food medicine, purifying both body and soul through the disciplined restriction of eating. The various fasting periods prescribed by the Church were understood to have specific health benefits, cleansing the body of accumulated toxins and rebalancing the humors. The medieval feast, in contrast to the fast, was seen as a celebration of abundance that restored the body's strength and renewed social bonds. The alternation between fasting and feasting created a rhythm that was thought to be essential for both physical and spiritual health. As our journey through medieval foodways draws toward its close, it's important to address some of the persistent myths and misconceptions that have grown up around medieval eating habits. The popular image of medieval food as universally bland, monotonous, and barely edible is largely a creation of later centuries that looked back on the Middle Ages with a mixture of ignorance and condescension. One of the most persistent myths is that medieval people ate enormous turkey legs as a regular part of their diet. This image, popularized by Renaissance fairs and Hollywood movies, is completely anachronistic. Turkeys are native to the Americas and were unknown in medieval Europe. The large roasted birds that graced medieval tables were more likely to be geese, swans, or peacocks. Another common misconception is that spices were used primarily to hide the taste of spoiled meat. This myth assumes that medieval people were either too poor or too ignorant to obtain fresh meat, and that they routinely ate contaminated food. In reality, spices were far too expensive to waste on spoiled meat, and medieval people were quite skilled at detecting and avoiding contaminated food. The idea that medieval people routinely ate spoiled meat also ignores the sophisticated preservation techniques that were widely used. Salting, smoking, and other preservation methods could keep meat edible for months, and people who had invested significant resources in these processes were not likely to let their food spoil through carelessness. The myth of universally bland medieval food ignores the extensive use of herbs and local seasonings that were available to even the poorest families. While exotic spices were expensive, every medieval cook had access to herbs like parsley, sage, thyme, and onions that could add significant flavor to simple dishes. The image of medieval people as ignorant about nutrition is also false. While they didn't understand vitamins and minerals in the modern sense, they had sophisticated knowledge about which foods promoted health and which could cause illness. This knowledge was based on centuries of observation and experience, and much of it was surprisingly accurate. The supposed monotony of medieval diet is another exaggeration. While the diet of a medieval peasant was certainly limited compared to modern standards, it still included a wide variety of grains, vegetables, dairy products, and occasional meat. Seasonal variations provided additional diversity, and special occasions brought foods that were otherwise unavailable. The portrayal of medieval people as constantly on the verge of starvation is also misleading. While famines did occur periodically, they were exceptional events rather than the normal state of affairs. Most medieval people, most of the time, had adequate nutrition to support active, productive lives. Now, the myth that medieval people didn't understand hygiene ignores the extensive food safety practices that were widely followed. People knew the importance of clean water, fresh ingredients, and proper cooking techniques. The high mortality rates of the medieval period were more often due to infectious diseases than to food poisoning. The stereotype of the drunken medieval peasant stumbling around in an alcoholic haze is another distortion. While alcohol was consumed daily, it was usually in the form of weak ale that contained very little alcohol. People drank ale for hydration and nutrition, not to become intoxicated. The image of medieval cuisine as primitive ignores the sophisticated cooking techniques that were developed during this period. Medieval cooks were skilled in roasting, boiling, frying, baking, and numerous other preparation methods. They understood how to combine flavors, control cooking temperatures, and present food in visually appealing ways. The supposed lack of vegetables in medieval diet is another myth. While meat often gets more attention in historical records because it was more expensive and noteworthy, vegetables were actually the foundation of most people's diet. Peas, beans, onions, leeks, cabbage, and numerous other vegetables were grown and consumed in large quantities. The reality of medieval food was far more complex and interesting than the stereotypes suggest. It was a cuisine shaped by climate, geography, religion, social structure, and centuries of accumulated knowledge about nutrition and food preparation. Within the constraints of their technology and resources, medieval people created a food culture that sustained millions of people and provided the foundation for later culinary developments. Medieval cooking techniques, ingredients, and recipes influenced the development of modern European cuisine in countless ways. Many of the herbs, spices, and preparation methods that we consider traditional actually have their roots in medieval practices. The great cuisines of France, Italy, and other European countries grew directly from medieval foundations. The medieval understanding of the connection between food and health, while expressed in different terms than modern nutrition science, contained many insights that are still valid today. The emphasis on fresh, seasonal ingredients, the importance of variety in diet, and the recognition that food affects both physical and mental well-being are all concepts that modern nutritionists would endorse. The social aspects of medieval eating, the importance of sharing meals, the connection between food and community, and the role of feast and fast in marking the rhythm of life offer valuable perspectives for our modern world, where eating has often become a solitary and mechanical activity. As the fire burns lower in our imaginary medieval hearth, and the last traces of warmth fade from the evening air, we can reflect on the remarkable journey we've taken through the kitchens, halls, and markets of the Middle Ages. We've seen how ordinary people, working with simple ingredients and basic tools, created a food culture that sustained entire civilizations for centuries. The medieval relationship with food was characterized by respect, creativity, and deep understanding of the connections between eating and all other aspects of life. Food was never taken for granted, but was approached with a reverence due to something essential for survival. Every meal was an achievement, every feast a celebration, every fast a discipline that strengthened both body and spirit. The ingenuity of medieval cooks in creating flavorful, nutritious meals from limited ingredients continues to inspire modern chefs and home cooks. The techniques they developed for preserving food, the herbs and spices they cultivated, and the recipes they created form the foundation of much that we still enjoy today. Perhaps most importantly, the medieval approach to food reminds us that eating is not merely a biological necessity, but a fundamentally human activity that connects us to the earth, to our communities, and to the long chain of generations who have faced the same basic challenge of turning raw ingredients into nourishment. As you drift toward sleep, let yourself imagine the warmth of that medieval hearth, the satisfaction of a simple but well-prepared meal, and the comfort of sharing food with others who understand its true value. In a world that sometimes seems to have lost touch with the fundamental realities of food and sustenance, the medieval kitchen offers wisdom that transcends the centuries. The embers are growing dim now, the last flames dancing quietly in the darkness. The medieval day is ending as it began, with a grateful acknowledgement of the gifts that sustain life. Sleep well, knowing that you carry with you the stories of countless generations who found joy, community, and meaning in the simple act of breaking bread together. Tomorrow the sun will rise on new adventures, new discoveries, and new stories waiting to be told. But tonight, rest in the knowledge that you have walked with our ancestors through their daily struggles and triumphs, sharing in the eternal human experience of transforming the gifts of the earth into the sustenance of life.